Hello, I'm Jane and welcome to the last lesson of my workshop with Strathmore. Throughout these previous 3 lessons, we explored and we experimented to fill our sketchbook with botanical, landscape and animal motifs. I'm keeping my most favorite subject for the last. Today we will explore portraits and not just regular watercolor portrait sketches, but also how to stylize a portrait. So I will show you my way of trying to stylize a portrait in a very colorful and fun way, directly into your sketchbook. So let's get started. Here's the art supplies that we're going to be using for this lesson. I limited my palette down to 7 colors, plus we're going to use the Memory white gouache. This is titanium white to add some highlights to our portraits. We're going to be using kitchen salt for effects. Spray bottle is a must for me, whatever I paint. Then some drawing supplies to either create a sketch or trace the sketch that is provided down below in the instructions. The particular colors that we're going to be using, I'm going to show you during the lesson itself, but let's check out the brushes. The first brush is Princeton Heritage round brush number 2. I'm going to use this one for details. This is a pretty amazing brush, very sharp tip and a little bit on the stiffer side, so that will help me out with drawing some of the highlights or tiny little details. The main 2 brushes are also Princeton Neptune. I really love this dagger brush. This is 1/4 of an inch. The hair is soft. This brush is so versatile that I use it all the time, no matter the subject, but during portraits mostly I use it for the hair and for the stylization. In this lesson, I'm also using Princeton Neptune number 8. This is travel brush round, and travel brushes are really awesome to have in your collection when you're using sketchbooks, because sketchbooks are transportable. This type of brush is really easy to bring anywhere you go, while also not having to worry about destroying the tip of the brush. And this brush is very useful when it comes to the portrait techniques, because you can apply the paint with it. Since it's soft, it spreads the paint really evenly, but then with just clean water, you can create a smooth edge or smoothing out your edges, which is one of the really crucial techniques to handle when it comes to portraiture. You can't really do this well with a brush that is stiffer. That is why I really prefer these Neptune brushes over something that is a bit more stiff. I'm also going to be using one more brush. If you don't have that one, you will be fine with just the dagger brush, because you can work with just these 3. For the stylization that I did during the portrait workshop, I am using a square wash. This is 1/2 of an inch, also Princeton Neptune. And this will help me out to apply large washes or just be a bit more expressive, a little bit more quickly. You should have in your collection large brushes as well as smaller brushes, because this will help you out with achieving a wide variety of techniques. So these are all the supplies, and let's get started with the lesson. I'll work with this Neptune round brush for now, and let me first introduce the colors in my limited palette. It is helpful to do this exercise along with me, as color mixing is important for portraits, especially because skin color can differ so much. It is highly unlikely that you will only use one premixed skin tone for most of your portraits. And so it comes in handy to know how your skin tone can be made and how to change it if it's needed. I'll be working with cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson hue, Van Dyke brown, Payne's gray and cobalt blue light. This is my limited palette. To create a skin tone, we'll be mixing yellow and red together. Important is to find the right color, consistency and water down your paint. For the cheeks, we'll be adding alizarin crimson to the mixture, and so this is a more red version of the skin tone. When you add Van Dyke brown, you'll get darker skin tone, and when you add Payne's gray on top of this mix, you will get the darkest complexion color. To get shadows on the face, you can try mixing cadmium red light with cobalt blue light. This mix is a cooler version of the skin tone and suits the darker areas in the face very well. You can water down this mixture if you wish for a lighter shadow. I encourage you to do this mixing exercise before starting to paint a portrait sketch. And in the following demo, I will show you how I approach painting a quick and spontaneous portrait sketch. For my subject, I drew 2 girls. One will have lighter and the other one darker skin color. You can find this sketch down in the instructions sheet. I'll start with the light skin tone first, as this one is easier. I will cover the face with a light wash of paint, only leaving some highlights untouched. If you fail to do this, no worries, because we can still lift the pigment later on to create highlights or use white gouache. This is just a sketchbook work and I don't really mind. Here in the neck area, I try to diffuse the paint with either wet brush or spray bottle. I then return to the face with the brush and try to lighten some of the areas by lifting the pigment gently. I often add watered down red paint to the nose and lips and try to do this while the wash is still wet. You can gently push the paint around with your soft brush. I then add alizarin crimson to the cheeks and then let this layer dry. So let's do the darker skin now. I'm starting first layer with darker version of the skin tone mixed with yellow, red and Van Dyke brown. I only managed to leave out few highlights and diffuse the paint in the neck area. The painting approach is the same as in the previous face. When you start lifting pigment and bringing back some light, you will see more impact than in the previous face, and that's because the contrast is higher. So I try to be careful only to soften and not clean up all the pigment in these areas. Adding red also gets more impactful with this color palette. I'm adding alizarin crimson into the darker skin tone and then painting around nose area, lips and cheeks. The wash is still quite wet and this helps me to merge the colors together. After I'm done, I'll have to dry both faces to be able to continue. For me, the next step is adding hair color before I paint shadows of the face. It helps a lot to see all the colors and tonal values on the page to be able to paint shadows of the face better. Without hair color, both faces can appear very dark in comparison with the white background, but once that you add dark hair, then you'll see how pale they actually are. Hair is one of the easier subjects to paint and I use dagger brush for this. I even apply some dry brush technique as I paint the strings at the bottom. Keep in mind that hair also have lighter and darker parts, so I use more watered down paint or more intense mixture in these areas. For this brown hair, I use more yellow in the lighter areas just to make it more colorful. Here I try to use my fingernail to scratch the surface and create some highlights in the hair. This is a fun technique to use from time to time, but make sure that the wash isn't too wet though. Time to add dark hair, and for this I mostly use Payne's Gray. I'll be watering down the mixture for the lighter parts of the hair just like before, and also adding more pigment to those areas that would be darker, and this can help you create more depth. Here in this area that is not so important and should be out of focus, I just draw a few hair strings and then use spray bottle to diffuse the paint. The idea is to keep the faces sharper and in focus, while the hair can be more stylized and only painted as a suggestion and not too descriptive. So you can let this all dry now. When your paper has dried, we can continue with second layer, and that covers shading of the face. So I'm starting with a mixture of red and cobalt blue. I'm painting in the shadows to some of the areas of the face that would appear darker, and then I have to soften the edges of the painted areas with the soft round brush. I'm now softening the edges of the painted areas to merge them with the previous layer. I was trying to do this with both round and dagger brush, but the round brush was more helpful, so I ended up working with that one. This technique can be a little bit messy at first. Sometimes I accidentally smudge the entire shadow and have to start over, add more paint and then merge it gently with the previous layer. So this might take some time and some pushing the paint around to get the values right. But I also want to say that this is a study, so don't feel any pressure to do a perfectly shaded portrait here. As long as you get the shadows a bit darker than the skin tone, you will be fine. Here I accidentally smudged the paint and created a wet wash all over the bottom part of the face. So when this happens, try to lift the pigment from the areas that are supposed to be lighter and then dry everything. You can continue adding darker values in another layer. This paper can handle quite many layers. Here I'm adding a few darker details around the lip area and softening the dark shadow underneath the chin. Finally, I managed to divide the face from the neck area here. I will leave the darker face for now and try to shade the pale one. Here the shadow color will be more watered down and therefore the work is a little bit easier. Even on this pale portrait, there are parts that need more contrast, and for this I'll be using a more creamy mixture of the shadow color. This is still a mixture of red and cobalt blue. Technique is the same as before, applying the paint and then attempting to soften the edge to blend this in with the first layer. Here I'm adding more red to the lips and cheek area and then continuing to shade the nose. Right side of the nose will be a bit darker than the other side that's facing the light. I'm now drawing the entire face and then trying to add darkest shadows, especially to the neck area. I discovered after drawing this that I lost quite a lot of contrast, and so I'm adding more shadows around the eyes again as my second attempt. As the face gets more depth and contrast, it is needed to go back to the hair area and add more contrast to the parts that are supposed to be darker. This helps out to balance the entire portrait. Now for the final step, we need to add the darkest and sharpest details. Usually it's the lashes, eyebrows, some areas around the mouth. If you have a tiny round brush, you can use it for this part, but I just decided that this round brush has such a sharp tip that I don't have to switch brushes. So the shadow below the chin was still a bit too light, so I decided to add more dark color here and just a couple of hair strings to tie everything. Here I'm adding similar details to the darker portrait. In the end, I tried to imitate freckles by splattering some paint on top, and when it all dries, you can remove the tape, and here is the first portrait study. I hope that you found this helpful as a base for your more stylized portrait. In this next demo, we are going to do a simple portrait stylization, and sometimes I like to work on the entire page spread. This is a lot of fun and gives you so much more room to experiment on. Make sure to use masking tape around the entire sketchbook. I do not like when the paint gets in between pages, so I always tape everything together before painting. I'm quickly sketching a simple portrait idea with not too many details, just the position of the head and a general flow of the hair. I used a reference image to get inspired. You can find it down below in the instructions sheet as well as my sketch. But I also modified this initial idea very much as the work progresses. You can get more free with your ideas even if you are using references. You can try to use the images for general features and then use your imagination and watercolor techniques for the rest. I'm sketching with Rembrandt graphite pencil in 2B and cleaning up the sketch with kneaded eraser. My portraits, they take some time to get right, but with a gentle eraser you don't have to worry about destroying the paper texture. When I decide which lines are correct, I then erase the rest and make the final outline a bit bolder. Before painting, I go over the sketch one more time with kneaded eraser, getting rid of all the extra graphite so that it doesn't smudge with water. First step will be to get some skin tone in, and this is pale skin, so you can mix the yellow and red together, creating the base. Make sure that in your first wash you evade some highlights so that the skin can glow. I'm using the dagger brush, but round is also fine. I'm tilting the sketchbook with my left hand to help the watercolor flow towards the bottom. This evens out the first wash. Here around the neck area, I'm diffusing the wash, creating some random splatters as if the skin tone fades into the background. While this wash is still wet, try to add some red to the nose and lips. Adding alizarin crimson to the cheeks will be a bit more wild, but I love the effect that it has on the face. I added quite a lot of paint here, so I had to smudge and correct. To ears, try adding rather cadmium red than alizarin crimson. These are two types of red, one is cooler and cadmium red is warmer, which better represents the translucency of the ears. Here actually I'm already stylizing and trying to be less controlled, more free, which results in a mess on a page. But I know that we can clean this up later, so I'm counting on the watercolor pools to dry into some nice effects that we can utilize. It is time to add Payne's Gray to the hair, and I'm diluting it down a lot, and so the actual hair color will be more transparent and have a purplish undertone. I will now clean the largest pools of water and let this dry so that we can begin with adding wilder colors in the following layer. Now when it's 100% dry, you can grab a large brush and we will paint these red flowers to the page randomly, but also trying to arrange them in a harmonious way around the face. I'm using a square wash Neptune brush as this flat shape helps me to create flower shape quite quickly. Here I'm diffusing the paint with spray bottle a little bit, and I'll be adding yellow to the bottom of a couple of flowers to refresh and change this red slightly. Here I'm mixing green from yellow and cobalt blue, but I wasn't quite happy with the particular shade, so I decided to add my favorite green yellow My Merry Blue paint to this color palette. This new bright yellow-green made these red flowers really pop. I added the greens in between the red flowers into the wet wash, but I made sure that I didn't cover all of the white areas. I left out some white spaces in between so that this wash can breathe a little bit. This part of the process is a lot about experimentation, trial and error. There's no correct way to do this. I just try to observe how watercolor behaves in a wet wash and then utilize those effects in the stylization. For example, one rule is to avoid wetting the face area because I do not want the blooms to happen there. Another tip is to lay colors next to each other and do not mix them on the page because red and green mixed together, they create a muddy gray, so we do not want that. Now I want to carefully add more intense Payne's Gray for those parts of the hair that will be darker and will frame the face. Here it really helps that the neck area is dry, otherwise the dark paint will bleed inside. With the dagger brush I paint a few hair strings. Here I'm painting stems of the flowers with green mixture. In some areas the line will bleed and appear blurry, and in other areas that are now dry will stay sharp. I like the final outcome and how this looks when it dries. Here I'm adding more splatters with different colors, reds and greens. Larger splatters with more intense color create nice balancing element once they dry, so I try to include them as well. In between the flower stems, I draw dark hair strings, wet in wet. This will look like the flowers are in front of the hair. I'm then adding table salt to the watery paint and keep on balancing the wash with reds, greens and Payne's Gray until I'm satisfied. And now we let this crystallize and dry completely. We can now create the shading mixture of cadmium red and cobalt blue. In this next step, I want to shade the face and give it some volume. Just like in the previous demo, I'm searching for darker areas of the face, applying paint and softening the edges to merge with the previous underpainting. This stage takes some time. The shadow around the nose is a bit more tricky. Here I'm paying more attention to the reference photo again and trying to find where the shadows are the darkest. Softening in this area takes some maneuvering with your soft brush. There is another tricky area, and that's where chin meets the neck. From this angle there isn't an exact neckline visible, it's just fading of the tone, and so I'm mingling the paint with my brush to imply this. Here I'm trying to add more tone to the area around eyes and eyebrows as the previous layer faded a bit. Drawing the face and applying reds to the areas around the eyes and lips. I'm basically trying to give the face more depth in this layer, enhancing the shadows on the neck and the cheeks. You will have to spend some time trying to find the right balance here. When you feel like there isn't enough contrast in your portrait, just dry everything and add another layer. I'm adding splatters to create freckles, and here I'm adding red to the flower behind the hair, and this makes the hair stand out now. I just love this negative painting effect, so how about we make use of it some more? For example, here we have two options. Either we can paint the hair dark, or we can add darkness behind the hair and in between the flower stems. So I chose the latter option, and I'm enjoying the impact that it brings to the painting. I decided to continue with this trend and kept on cutting out light green stems of the flowers with dark background. You don't have to be afraid to use spray bottle again to diffuse the background area a little bit. Just make sure that it doesn't diffuse the edges that you want to keep sharp. I had one accident in the neck area there, but I decided to keep it, and in the end it looked quite balanced even with this dark bleed. Adding just a few more pops of red before drying this and moving on to adding the darkest details. So lastly, I'm drawing the dark parts of the eyebrows, lashes, nostrils, and a few areas around lips. And now you can dry everything again, because it's time for absolutely last stylization, which will include white gouache and tiny round brush. This part is a cherry on top. With tiny brush, I'm drawing in highlights to the face, but also creating some white divisions between flowers, stems, hair strands to tie this portrait together. When you have a wild wash of paint like this one, drawing in between the splatters with white paint makes it really shine, but try to find balance here as well. Now we can remove the tape from all around the sketchbook and enjoy the look of our newly stylized portrait painting. So I think during these 4 lessons that we covered quite a variety of topics and subjects, from these botanicals, this is the sunflower and the poppy, through landscapes and sceneries. This one was a really fun one, and the lavender fields and more geometric Santorini, through fun little animal sketches and colorful explorations. Oh, this one also, that was a fun one. Until we reached the portrait topic, which can be quite intimidating, but we handled that as well. This is the final stylized piece. All of these are just example, like there's so many ways to fill out your sketchbook. Remember that sketchbook is for exploration. You don't really have to be timid about your sketches. You don't have to take that sketchbook as something way too precious. You can take notes. This is basically your art journal. So the more you explore, the more you will learn, and you can then apply it to your larger pieces if you wish. All of these techniques and the examples that we went through, they can be applied to different subjects. You can switch the coloring, you can switch the stylization, and the more you explore, the more your own style will develop. So I hope that you had fun, and I will see you around. Bye!